If you come to the UK illegally, you will be detained and deported and never, ever allowed to stay, period.
This will be the largest deportation campaign in British history. 900,000 illegal migrants will be deported. Nigel Farage says entry without permission ends in immediate detention and permanent removal. The announcement signals an unprecedented enforcement drive across Britain. The plan moves beyond rhetoric into action. Under Farage's proposal, the Royal Navy is deployed across the Channel, with military vessels positioned at key transit routes. Thousands of detainees are to be transferred under armed supervision, supported by a newly formed force of 10,000 specialised enforcement officers. The operation is described as logistical, not symbolic, a coordinated effort designed to cut illegal arrivals from nearly 2,000 a day to fewer than 20. Officials compare the scale to a wartime mobilisation. Supporters say it restores control. Critics warn it redraws the line between civil authority and military power. But before the plan was decided, Starmer cancelled it, but much of the media covered it up. That's why you're watching UK Instability. Subscribe now to hear the whole truth about how the deportation plan was cancelled. The response from Downing Street was immediate and uncompromising. Prime Minister Keir Starmer rejected the proposal outright, calling it racist, intolerant, and legally impossible. He warned that mass deportations would violate human rights law and damage Britain's international standing. Within hours, tension spilt onto the streets. Demonstrators gathered outside Parliament, chanting for action and accusing the government of betraying public safety. Police lines were reinforced as anger mounted. Inside Westminster, ministers insisted the plan would never receive approval. Outside, the mood was darker. Protesters branded Starmer a traitor, demanding the dissolution of Parliament. The political divide hardened, turning a policy dispute into a national confrontation that would soon spiral beyond control. At 7:34 p.m, the situation on the streets had deteriorated rapidly. What began as an organised protest outside Parliament escalated into open disorder. Police units reported bottles and fireworks being thrown from multiple directions as crowds surged forward. Riot shields were raised. Orders were issued to hold the line. Within minutes, officers were forced into retreat as pressure mounted from all sides. Eyewitnesses described at least 40 fireworks launched directly at police formations, with several officers briefly surrounded. Emergency sirens echoed through Westminster as additional units were rushed in to prevent a full breach. At the same time, 5 hotels housing migrants were placed under emergency protection, surrounded by police cordons. Despite the unrest, the Royal Navy vessels assigned to the deportation operation remained docked, awaiting authorization that never came. Protesters accused the government of paralysis, claiming the state had mobilized force against its own citizens while refusing to act on border enforcement. At 8 p.m, reports emerged of vehicles being blocked and officers trapped inside vans. Social media was flooded with footage of clashes, while officials urged calm. The contrast was stark. Escalating street chaos on one side and a government unwilling to activate the very operation it had spent weeks debating. The sense of national control, many said, was slipping away in real time. At 8:15 p.m, Whitehall reached its breaking point. What had begun as a political dispute transformed into a full-scale crisis of authority. Reports of fresh knife attacks emerged from South London, reigniting public anger. Within minutes, footage circulated online showing police vans surrounded and officers trapped inside as crowds shouted accusations of two-tier policing. At the centre of the storm was Farage's central claim, that the country's rising violence was no coincidence. He argued that unchecked illegal migration had created parallel criminal networks operating beyond effective control. According to figures cited by his camp, serious knife crime could fall by 40 to 65% if mass removals were enforced. Grooming gangs, he claimed, would lose more than 4,500 active operatives almost overnight. Supporters pointed to the data: machete attacks rising, phone thefts occurring every 3 minutes, and police stretched thin while immigration offenders remained in the system for years. They argued the issue was no longer ideological but mathematical. Too many offenders, too few consequences. Meanwhile, the government stood firm. Starmer reiterated that no one could be deported based on nationality or belief, calling the proposals dangerously simplistic. But on the streets, the mood had shifted. Protesters no longer demanded explanations, they demanded action. By nightfall, the narrative had hardened. To supporters, the blocked operation symbolised a state unwilling to defend its citizens. To critics, it represented the collapse of law into populism. Either way, the moment marked a turning point, when public fear, political paralysis, and rising violence converged into a single explosive question. Who still controls the streets of Britain? By 9 p.m, the confrontation had shifted from the streets to the national psyche. What emerged was no longer just a debate about borders, but a collision between two versions of Britain. On one side stood the government backed by human rights law, international courts, and institutional restraint. On the other stood a growing public bloc that believed restraint had become surrender. Commentators began describing it as a nation divided not by class or party, but by fear and silence. Supporters of the deportation plan argued that ordinary citizens had been pushed into quiet compliance. They pointed to figures showing over 15,000 arrests linked to online speech, while violent offenders remained free pending lengthy legal reviews. To them, the imbalance was unmistakable. Farage labelled this group the silent majority, millions who opposed mass migration, but no longer felt safe expressing that view publicly. Polling data referenced in the broadcast suggested a widening gap between private opinion and public expression. In anonymous surveys, support for large-scale removal surged. In public forums, the same views all but disappeared. The reason, critics said, was fear. Fear of losing jobs, fear of being investigated, fear of social or legal consequences for questioning policy. In this climate, silence became survival. Meanwhile, government officials rejected accusations of suppression. They insisted law enforcement was acting proportionately, targeting only hate speech and disorder. But images circulating online told a different story. Riot police confronting protesters while reports of machete attacks continued elsewhere. To many viewers, the optics were damaging. The narrative hardened further when attention turned to funding. Figures cited during the broadcast claimed the state was spending $6 million per day on migrant accommodation. Hotels in coastal towns had been requisitioned indefinitely, draining local economies and fueling resentment among residents who felt abandoned. By the end of the hour, one theme dominated public discussion: enforcement versus hesitation. Supporters of the plan believed that without decisive action, crime would continue rising, borders would remain porous, and trust in institutions would collapse entirely. Opponents warned that such measures would destroy civil liberties and push the country toward authoritarianism. What neither side disputed was this: the divide had become structural, and once that line was drawn, it could not easily be erased. As the night progressed, attention shifted away from the streets and toward the machinery of the state itself. The question was no longer whether unrest could be contained, but whether the system governing Britain was capable of responding at all. What unfolded was a growing sense that the country had reached a legal and institutional deadlock. At the centre of the debate stood the issue of enforcement. Critics of the government argued that the failure to act was not due to a lack of resources, but to legal paralysis. They pointed to the role of the European Court of Human Rights, claiming its rulings had effectively blocked large-scale deportations. According to figures cited in the broadcast, fewer than a fraction of those ordered to leave the UK were actually removed each year, despite thousands of failed asylum claims. Farage seized on this point, arguing that sovereignty itself had been diluted. He claimed Britain could no longer control its own borders while bound by external courts. His proposal was blunt: withdrawal from the ECHR to clear the legal path for enforcement. Without it, he said, every removal would be delayed by appeals, injunctions, and procedural deadlock. A system that cannot act, he argued, is a system that has already failed. The government pushed back forcefully. Ministers warned that leaving the court would isolate Britain diplomatically, damage trade relations, and undermine decades of legal precedent. They insisted reform must happen within existing frameworks, not outside them. But critics countered that those frameworks had produced the current crisis, not prevented it. The economic dimension deepened the tension. Reports cited during the broadcast claimed the government was spending $8 million per day housing migrants, much of it in hotels along coastal towns. Local councils described budgets under strain, tourism declining, and public services stretched thin. For residents watching their communities change, the issue no longer felt abstract. It felt personal. Meanwhile, enforcement agencies remained constrained. Police leadership acknowledged privately that deportation backlogs and legal appeals had created a bottleneck that no amount of patrols could fix. Prisons remained overcrowded. Deportation orders stalled. The system, critics said, was running in place. As the hours passed, a new realization set in. This was no longer a short-term crisis. It was structural. The conflict was not between protesters and police, or politicians and voters. It was between two incompatible visions of governance, one prioritizing legal restraint, the other demanding immediate control. By the end of the night, the question facing Britain had narrowed to a single point. Could the state enforce its own laws without rewriting them? Or had the balance tipped so far that authority itself had become conditional? The answer, many feared, would define not just the next election, but the future shape of the country. By the final hour, the debate had moved beyond policy and into something far more consequential: the question of authority itself. What had begun as a dispute over borders and enforcement now stood as a test of whether the British state could still act decisively in moments of national strain. The collapse of consensus was unmistakable. Supporters of stronger enforcement argued that hesitation had become the default response to every crisis. They pointed to years of delayed decisions, stalled removals, and legal obstacles that turned firm policies into symbolic gestures. In their view, the failure to act had sent a clear message. Consequences were optional, and the system could be pushed without resistance. Opponents, however, warned of a different danger. They argued that rapid enforcement, particularly on the scale being proposed, risked eroding civil liberties and setting precedents that could not be reversed. To them, the crisis was not one of borders, but of restraint. Once the state began overriding legal protections, they said, no boundary would remain secure. As the debate intensified, the focus shifted toward the future. Analysts noted that public confidence in institutions had reached a fragile point. Trust in law enforcement, the courts, and political leadership appeared increasingly fragmented. What once might have been resolved through parliamentary debate now plays out in the streets, online, and in polarized media narratives. Farage's supporters framed the moment as a final warning. They argued that without decisive enforcement, public patience would eventually collapse. The repeated cycle, arrivals, legal delays, release into communities, had, in their view, undermined faith in the rule of law. The question was no longer whether reform was needed, but whether it could come in time to prevent deeper instability. The government, meanwhile, held firm. Officials maintained that order could not be restored through force alone, and that long-term solutions required cooperation, legal consistency, and international engagement. They rejected claims of national decline, insisting that Britain remained a country governed by law, not emotion. Yet for many watching, the divide had already become permanent. The language of compromise had faded. In its place stood two competing visions of the nation's future, one built on enforcement and control, the other on legal restraint and gradual reform. As the broadcast drew to a close, one reality was impossible to ignore. The debate had outgrown the original policy proposal. It was now about identity, authority, and who ultimately decides the direction of the country. Whether through ballots or confrontation, reform or resistance, the path ahead would not be quiet. The tension that surfaced that night would not disappear with morning light. It had settled into the foundation of national politics, unresolved, deeply felt, and waiting for its next turning point. Britain now stands at a crossroads. A nation built on law, fairness, and quiet strength finds itself torn between fear and hope, anger and restraint. Behind the headlines are ordinary people, parents, workers, communities, who simply want safety, stability, and a future they can trust. This is no longer about politics alone. It's about whether the country can heal before division becomes permanent. The question now belongs to the public. What kind of Britain should come next? Share your thoughts. Speak your truth. Because silence, in moments like this, shapes the future just as much as action.